There's a moment in history that should haunt every person who saves money, trusts institutions, or believes that hard work leads to security. It happened a century ago in Germany, and within 18 months it destroyed an entire social class, turned lifetime savings into worthless paper, and created the economic chaos that would eventually bring Adolf Hitler to power. This wasn't a natural disaster or a foreign invasion, it was hyperinflation, the complete collapse of a currency, and with it, the erasure of the German middle class. Workers who had saved for decades watched their nest eggs evaporate. Pensioners starved because their fixed incomes couldn't buy bread. The educated professional class, the engineers, teachers, doctors, and civil servants who formed the backbone of German society, were reduced to poverty while speculators and debtors became wealthy overnight. And the truly terrifying part is that it didn't happen by accident. It was the predictable result of policy choices made by a government that chose to print money rather than face political reality. The Weimar hyperinflation isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a warning about what happens when trust in money evaporates, when savings become worthless, and when an entire society discovers that the paper in their wallets is nothing more than paper. The story begins not with inflation, but with defeat. When World War I ended in November 1918, Germany faced catastrophe on every front. 4 years of total war had killed 2 million German soldiers and left millions more wounded. The economy was shattered, industrial production had collapsed, and the population was starving under the Allied blockade. The Kaiser abdicated, the empire dissolved, and into the chaos emerged the Weimar Republic, a fragile democracy born in defeat and immediately blamed for it. The new government faced impossible choices from the moment it took power. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed crushing reparations on Germany. The Allies demanded 132 billion gold marks in compensation for war damages, an astronomical sum equivalent to roughly $442 billion in today's money. Germany was also forced to surrender territory, give up its colonies, and accept limits on its military. The reparations alone would have been manageable under normal circumstances, but circumstances were anything but normal. Germany had financed the war not through taxes but through borrowing, accumulating 156 billion marks in debt by 1918. The strategy had been based on the assumption that Germany would win and force the losers to pay. When that didn't happen, the debt remained, and now reparations were added on top. The government faced a fiscal nightmare. Revenue from taxes couldn't come close to covering expenses, let alone debt service and reparations. The traditional solution would have been to raise taxes dramatically, cut spending, and implement painful austerity measures. But the Weimar government was politically weak, governing a population traumatized by war and defeat. Raising taxes would be politically suicidal. Cutting spending would mean defaulting on domestic obligations to workers, pensioners, and war veterans who were already suffering. So the government chose the path of least resistance. It would print money. At first this seemed to work. The printing presses ran, the government paid its bills, and life continued. Prices rose, but not catastrophically. Between 1919 and 1921, inflation was significant but manageable, similar to what other countries experienced after the war. The exchange rate went from roughly 8 marks per US dollar before the war to about 60 marks per dollar by early 1921. This was problematic but not disastrous. The real destruction began in 1922, triggered by reparations and politics. In January 1923, when Germany missed a reparations payment, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, to seize coal and manufactured goods as payment in kind. The German government responded with a policy of passive resistance, calling for workers to strike and refuse cooperation with the occupiers. It was framed as patriotic defiance, and millions of workers across the Ruhr followed the call. But striking workers still needed to eat. Their families still needed shelter. So the government promised to pay their wages even though they weren't working. 2 million people received government support for doing nothing, and the Treasury had no money to pay them. The solution was the same as before: print more money. But now the scale was different. The Reichsbank's printing presses ran around the clock, churning out banknotes in denominations that grew ever larger. And with each new wave of money flooding the economy, the mark's value collapsed further. The mathematics of hyperinflation are brutal and exponential. By mid-1922, the exchange rate had reached 320 marks per dollar. By December 1922, it was 7,400 marks per dollar. Prices were doubling every few weeks, then every few days. But this was just the beginning. Through 1923, the collapse accelerated into something unprecedented in modern history. By July 1923, the rate was 350,000 marks per dollar. By October, it was 25 billion marks per dollar. And by November 1923, at the peak of the crisis, $1 US was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Not billion. Trillion. The German mark had become functionally worthless, and with it the savings and security of millions. Understanding hyperinflation requires grasping not just numbers, but what they mean in daily life. Imagine going to work on Monday and earning a week's salary. By Friday, that money couldn't buy what it could have bought on Monday. By the next Monday, it couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Workers were paid twice daily, at lunch and after the shift ended, because waiting even a few hours meant the money would lose half its value. People didn't count money anymore. They waited. Bundles of banknotes, tied with string, were used to buy groceries. Children built blocks with worthless bills. The most famous story, perhaps apocryphal but capturing the reality, tells of a woman who left a basket full of money outside a shop while she went inside to buy something. When she came back, the money was dumped on the ground and the basket had been stolen. The basket had more value than millions of marks. Restaurants stopped printing prices on menus because they changed between the time guests sat down and when they finished eating. Waiters would circulate announcing new prices every hour. Workers carried wheelbarrows full of cash to buy groceries. And the absurdity of it all masked the human tragedy underneath. Because hyperinflation didn't just destroy money, it destroyed lives, and it did so selectively, punishing certain groups while enriching others. The middle class was devastated. These were people who had done everything right by the standards of their society. They'd worked hard, saved diligently, invested conservatively, and planned for the future. Teachers, civil servants, shopkeepers, accountants, engineers, the educated professional class that formed the social and economic backbone of Germany, they'd accumulated savings, bought government bonds, and trusted that their money would retain value. Hyperinflation destroyed them completely. Life savings that could have bought a house in 1921 couldn't buy a loaf of bread by late 1923. Government bonds, purchased as safe investments to fund retirement, became worthless paper. Bank accounts that represented decades of prudent saving evaporated overnight. Pensioners faced the worst suffering. These were people on fixed incomes, unable to work, depending on savings and pensions that had been calculated in a world where money held value. When inflation destroyed the mark, their pensions became meaningless. Stories from the period describe elderly people, once comfortably middle class, reduced to begging or scavenging. Thousands starved to death not because there was no food, but because they couldn't afford it. The cruelty was that food existed. Farmers had grain, bakers had bread, shops had goods, but prices were denominated in marks that changed by the hour, and pensioners on fixed incomes simply couldn't keep up. The middle class's destruction wasn't just economic, it was psychological and social. These people had believed in the system. They'd followed the rules, trusted institutions, and deferred gratification. And for what? To watch everything they'd built disappear while others who'd broken the rules or just been lucky prospered. Because hyperinflation, while devastating to savers, was a windfall for debtors and speculators. Anyone who'd borrowed money, taken out mortgages, or accumulated debt found themselves suddenly rich. A mortgage taken out in 1921 for 100,000 marks, representing years of payments, could be paid off in late 1923 with pocket change. The debt remained fixed in nominal terms, but the currency's collapse meant it could be repaid with worthless paper. Speculators made fortunes. Those with access to foreign currency or hard assets could buy up Germany for pennies on the dollar, or rather pennies on the trillion marks. Real estate, businesses, and property changed hands at absurd prices. Someone with dollars or gold could live like a king in Germany, buying entire buildings for what would have been lunch money in New York or London. Foreign visitors were shocked at how cheap everything was if you had stable currency. But for Germans with only marks, the country wasn't cheap, it was impossible. The social order collapsed along with the currency. Crime surged as desperate people resorted to theft and violence to survive. Law and order broke down because police and judges paid in worthless marks couldn't afford to do their jobs. Suicide spiked as people who'd lost everything chose death over destitution. Food riots broke out in cities as hungry urban populations marched into the countryside to loot farms. Farmers, seeing that money was worthless, refused to sell their crops, hoarding food while cities starved. The basic social contract, the agreement that work would be rewarded and saving would be prudent, shattered completely. And into this chaos came the extremists. The Communist Party grew, promising to overthrow the system that had failed so spectacularly. On the right, nationalist movements blamed the Republic, the Treaty of Versailles, and shadowy international conspiracies for Germany's suffering. And among those nationalist agitators was Adolf Hitler, an obscure former corporal who'd found his calling in beer halls and street corners, railing against the government, the Jews, and the November criminals who'd supposedly betrayed Germany. In November 1923, at the peak of the hyperinflation, Hitler attempted his first seizure of power with the beer hall putsch in Munich. It failed, and Hitler was arrested and imprisoned. But the crisis had given him a platform, an audience, and a message that resonated with millions who'd lost everything. The hyperinflation finally ended in late 1923, not through magic, but through painful reality. In August, a new government came to power under Gustav Stresemann, who recognized that the currency was beyond saving and only decisive action could stop the spiral. The government introduced the Rentenmark in November 1923, a new currency backed not by gold, which Germany didn't have, but by mortgages on German land and industrial assets. It was more psychological than real, but psychology was what mattered. The new currency was issued in limited quantities, which the old Reichsmark never had been. One Rentenmark was set equal to 1 trillion old marks, and crucially, the government stopped printing money to cover deficits. The introduction was called the miracle of the Rentenmark because prices stabilized almost immediately. The new currency held its value, shops reopened, farmers began selling food again, and economic activity resumed. By mid-1924, the Rentenmark was replaced by the Reichsmark under the Dawes Plan, which restructured reparations payments and provided American loans to stabilize Germany. The crisis was over, but the damage was permanent. An entire class of people had been destroyed. The middle-class families who'd built Germany's pre-war prosperity, who'd trusted in institutions and worked within the system, were gone. Some had died, literally starved to death, or committed suicide. Others survived but lost everything they'd accumulated. Their savings, their security, their faith in the system, all erased, and they never forgot. The generation that experienced Weimar hyperinflation carried the trauma for life. Decades later, elderly Germans who lived through 1923 still hoarded physical goods, still distrusted paper money, still remembered what it felt like to watch everything disappear. The political consequences shaped the 20th century. The hyperinflation destroyed faith in the Weimar Republic and in democracy itself. Millions concluded that the system couldn't be trusted, that their government had robbed them through incompetence or malice. When the Great Depression hit Germany in 1929, bringing mass unemployment and another economic crisis, Germans didn't rally behind the Republic. They turned to extremists who promised to restore order and greatness. The Nazi Party, which had been a fringe movement, became a mass party, and in 1933 Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor. Within months, democracy was dead and Germany was on the path to another war that would kill tens of millions. Historians debate how much the hyperinflation contributed to Hitler's rise. Some argue that the Depression was more important, that by 1929 Germany had recovered from the inflation and it was unemployment, not currency collapse, that drove voters to the Nazis. Others point out that the Depression wouldn't have been politically fatal if Germans hadn't already lost faith in institutions during the hyperinflation. The truth is probably both. The inflation erased the middle class and destroyed trust. The Depression finished the job by destroying hope. Together, they created conditions where fascism could thrive. What makes the Weimar hyperinflation so important isn't just what happened, but why it happened and how predictable it was. This wasn't a mysterious economic phenomenon beyond human understanding. It was cause and effect. The government printed money to finance spending it couldn't afford. Printing money increased the money supply. More money chasing the same goods meant higher prices. Higher prices meant more printing to maintain spending. And the cycle fed on itself until the currency collapsed entirely. Every step was foreseeable, and indeed, foreign economists warned German authorities repeatedly that their policies would lead to disaster. But the political incentives to print always outweighed the long-term consequences. The pattern has repeated throughout history. Revolutionary France with the assignats, the Confederacy with greybacks, Hungary after World War II with the pengu, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, Venezuela today. Every hyperinflation follows the same script. Government faces fiscal crisis, chooses to print money rather than make painful choices, inflation accelerates into hyperinflation, savings are destroyed, and social order collapses. The Weimar Republic's experience is simply the most studied and most consequential example because it occurred in a major industrial nation and led directly to the Nazi regime. The lesson should be that sound money isn't a luxury or an ideological preference. It's a prerequisite for social stability and economic justice. When money holds value, saving makes sense. People can plan for the future, invest in education, build businesses, and trust that their effort will be rewarded. When money becomes worthless, all of that disappears. Effort becomes meaningless because its fruits evaporate. Prudence is punished while speculation and debt are rewarded. The social fabric tears apart as everyone scrambles to survive rather than cooperate. The victims of hyperinflation are always the same. Those on fixed incomes, pensioners and workers. Those with savings in the currency, the prudent middle class. Those who trust the system and follow the rules, the people who make any society function. The winners are debtors whose obligations evaporate, speculators who gamble on the chaos, and those with access to hard assets or foreign currency. It's a massive redistribution of wealth from the many to the few, from the prudent to the reckless, from the middle to the extremes. And the political consequences are always destabilizing. People who lose everything stop believing in the system that failed them. They become susceptible to extremism, conspiracy theories, and authoritarians promising simple solutions. The Weimar hyperinflation's greatest tragedy isn't just the destroyed savings or the starving pensioners. It's the democratic system that collapsed under the weight of economic catastrophe, replaced by a totalitarian regime that would launch the most destructive war in human history. Today, when governments print trillions, when central banks buy assets with created money, when debt reaches levels never seen before, the Weimar Republic should serve as a warning. The mechanisms that destroyed the mark and erased the German middle class haven't changed. Print too much money and prices rise. Lose control of inflation and it can spiral into hyperinflation. Destroy savings and you destroy the middle class. And destroy the middle class and democracy itself becomes fragile. Modern economists argue that today's systems have safeguards, that central banks have learned from history, that sophisticated policy tools can prevent hyperinflation. And perhaps they're right. Perhaps the institutional knowledge and technical capacity exist to avoid Weimar's mistakes. But history also teaches that every system believes it's different, that this time is different, that they've solved the problems that destroyed previous generations. And then crisis comes, political pressure mounts, and the temptation to print rather than face reality proves irresistible once again. The Weimar hyperinflation isn't just history. It's a warning that sits in archives and textbooks, waiting for the next generation of policymakers who believe they can print their way out of crisis without consequences. It's a reminder that money is trust, and trust once broken is almost impossible to restore. And it's a memorial to the millions who did everything right, saved prudently, worked hard, and followed society's rules, only to watch everything disappear because their government chose the easy path over the responsible one. The German middle class that was erased in 1923 never fully recovered. The people who survived carried the trauma forever. The society that emerged was harder, more cynical, less trusting, and the political movements that arose from the ruins would plunge the world into darkness for a generation. All because a government wouldn't stop printing money and a population learned too late that paper promises are worthless when trust disappears. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History doesn't repeat, but the printing presses never stop, and somewhere right now another middle class is being erased 1 percentage point at a time.